Everyone who knows the name DuPont knows the Delaware gunpowder dynasty, the fortune stamped across American industry, and a network of children's hospitals. Almost no one knows the man who turned a share of it into the largest private land empire in Florida, and he was not a DuPont at all. His name was Edward Ball, a $5,000 a year in-law clerk who followed his brother-in-law to Jacksonville and never left. For 46 years he ran a machine most Floridians never saw, roughly 1 million acres of the Panhandle, the second largest private landholding in the state, a statewide chain of banks, second only to Barnett, a railroad, and a Gulf Coast paper mill. Yet from behind that curtain he broke a United States senator in a Democratic primary, outlasted one of the longest railroad strikes in American history, drew tens of millions of gallons a day through his mill, and through a rural faction that never won a statewide race, chose the men who governed Florida. How a salaried clerk who never stood for election came to own the Panhandle and pick its senators begins with the reason a DuPont fortune ever came to rest there. Chapter 1. The state that sold its taxes. The part of this story that usually goes untold is its beginning, because the beginning belongs to another man entirely. Before there was a machine, and before there was a clerk to run it, there was a fortune in flight, and a state that had just made itself the safest place in America to keep one. The fortune belonged to Alfred I duPont, and by the middle of the 1920s it was a fortune without a country. He had helped build the family gunpowder company into one of the great industrial concerns of the age, and then he had lost it. In a long and bitter struggle for control, his own cousins pushed him to the margins of the firm that carried his name, stripped him of authority, and left him, one of the richest men in the nation, an exile inside his own dynasty. Delaware, where the DuPonts were less a family than an institution, had turned cold on him. So he did what wounded men of means have always done. He went south. He arrived in Jacksonville in the middle of the decade, past 60, a widower long since remarried, blind in one eye from a shooting accident and going deaf, carrying the residue of one of the largest fortunes in the country and no settled idea of what to do with it. What he found was a state in the middle of reinventing itself, and a legislature that had recently done something no other state had dared to do. In 1924, Florida had amended its constitution to forbid, permanently, two of the taxes the rest of the country was learning to lean on. The state would levy no tax on personal income. It would levy no tax on inheritance. The prohibition was not an oversight and not a temporary measure. It was written into the founding document itself, deliberate and advertised, a standing invitation engraved in law. Florida had decided that the way to grow was not to tax wealth, but to import it, and so it offered the wealthy the one thing they valued most, which was to be left alone with their money, in life and in death. For a man in Alfred DuPont's position, the arithmetic was simple and enormous. In Delaware, and in most of the nation, a fortune the size of his was a standing target that the state would tax while he lived, and the grave would tax when he died. In Florida it was safe, protected by the Constitution itself. A state had, in effect, put itself up for the price of residency, and one of the few men alive who could easily meet that price had just moved in. This is the quiet root of everything that follows. The land empire that would one day cover 1 million acres of the Panhandle, the chain of banks, the railroad, the mill that drank a river, all of it grew from ground first broken by a tax code. Florida did not draw Alfred DuPont with its sunshine or its citrus. It drew him with a promise that it would never reach into his estate, and he believed the promise enough to move his fortune inside its borders and keep it there for the rest of his life. There is a way to see what came next as entirely ordinary, and a way to see it as something else, and both are true at the same time. In one telling, a rich old man simply retired to a friendlier state, as many thousands of rich men would after him, and put his idle money to work. In another, a single family's fortune, exempted by law from the levies that fell on everyone else, quietly bought its way toward the center of a state's affairs, until a man who would never once stand for election, never win a single vote, never hold any office at all, sat nearer to the levers of Florida's government than most of the officials Floridians actually chose. The same set of facts reads as a retirement or as a purchase, depending only on where a person happens to be standing. What the tax amendment could not supply was a manager. Alfred duPont had the fortune, and now he had the reasons to shelter it, but he was aging and ailing, and by temperament an inventor and a financier, not a builder of the patient, grinding, county-by-county kind of empire the Florida opening invited. The money had found its haven, but it had not yet found the hand that would put it to work. That hand had already arrived, unnoticed, in a man Alfred trusted more than almost anyone left in his life. He was not a duPont. He was not rich. He had come south on a salary, to keep the books and run the errands of the family he had married into. His name was Edward Ball, and the fortune that a state's tax law had drawn down to Florida was about to be placed, quietly and almost entirely, in his keeping. Chapter 2. The Clerk Who Answered to No One. While the newspapers of the day watched Alfred duPont, the aging financier, the exile, the last of the great names to come south, almost no one thought to watch the quiet man who kept his accounts. He was not a story. He held no title worth printing, drew no crowd, and made no speeches. He was the one who arranged the appointments and tallied the ledgers and carried the correspondence, the sort of man whose name appears nowhere in the histories of a moment and everywhere in what those moments actually produced. That near invisibility, more than any fortune, was the beginning of his power. His name was Edward Gresham Ball, born in the spring of 1888, and he was, in almost every particular, the opposite of the family he served. The duPonts were an institution, an inheritance measured in generations, a name that had been powerful before the man now signing its checks was even alive. Ball was a self-made man of modest reach, a small businessman who had made his own narrow way in the world with no dynasty behind him. He had not been born to money and did not expect it to arrive. What he had was a head for figures, a bottomless capacity for work, and a stubbornness that would in time become legendary. He was not an heir. He was a hired hand, and he never once pretended otherwise. The thread that bound him to the duPont fortune ran not through blood, but through marriage. Ball's sister, Jessie Ball, had become Alfred duPont's third wife, and it was that union, not any talent the family had spotted from afar, that first drew her brother into Alfred's orbit. In 1923, Ball went to work for his new brother-in-law, and the salary tells the whole story of where he stood. $5,000 a year, a clerk's wage, respectable and forgettable, the pay of a competent employee, and nothing more. When Alfred moved his money and his ailing body south, Ball followed, still on that salary, still keeping the books, a paid man attending to a rich one. Nothing in the arrangement announced what it would become, because thousands of men have kept the accounts of the wealthy without ever becoming more than bookkeepers. What set Ball apart was not his position, which was small, but his temperament, which was not. Beneath the mild exterior of the family clerk sat a man built for combat. He did not soften a disagreement or forget a slight. In a state where business and politics were still conducted through courtesy and quiet compromise, he treated both as war carried on by other means, and he meant to win them. There is a toast attributed to him, repeated so often that it hardened into a kind of signature, raised over a glass among friends and rivals alike. Confusion to the enemy. It was said with a smile, and it was not a joke. Decades later, when a wire service sat down to write his obituary, the single word it reached for was crusty, the plain American shorthand for a man who was hard, unyielding, and entirely at ease with being disliked. That was the temperament the duPont fortune had, without ever quite deciding to, taken into its keeping. And that is the quiet hinge of the whole story. A fortune the size of the duPont holdings might have been managed with caution, spent slowly, preserved as a monument to the man who had made it. Placed instead in the hands of a combative clerk who answered to no board, no electorate, and in practice to no one but himself, it became something else entirely. Not a legacy to be guarded, but an instrument to be used. Alfred duPont had found the manager his money still lacked. He had also, though no one saw it yet, handed a self-made brawler the means to remake a state. What that clerk was about to do with the money would have been unthinkable for a man drawing his wage. Within a few years, in the depths of the worst economic collapse the country had ever known, he would begin spending duPont dollars across the map of Northwest Florida on a scale no salaried employee had any business commanding. He was not buying for himself. He was buying for the fortune he served. But the hand on the checkbook and the hard will behind it were entirely his own. Chapter 3. The county bought in a single stroke. The signatures that redrew the map of Northwest Florida were gathered without ceremony, in the ordinary way a clerk closes a ledger. There was no auction crowd, no press gallery, no speech to mark the moment. There was only a stack of documents, a transfer of title, and a man drawing a modest salary reaching across a table on behalf of a fortune that was not his own. And when the ink was dry, in the year 1933, in the deepest trough of the Great Depression, the duPont interests owned a piece of Florida the size of a county. Roughly 240,000 acres of the Panhandle passed in that single stroke. Not a farm, not a tract assembled slowly over years, but a whole working country bought entire in one transaction at the exact moment when the rest of the nation had no money to bid against it. The depression that had ruined so many had done for Ball what no amount of patience could have managed on its own. It had emptied the field of rival buyers and driven the price of land and of everything standing upon it down to a level a careful man with liquid capital could simply absorb. Where others saw catastrophe, the clerk saw a clearance sale conducted across an entire region, and he bought. And what he bought was not merely ground. The 240,000 acres came with a machine already bolted to them. Folded into the same purchase was the Apalachicola Northern Railroad, a working line with its own locomotives and track, the veins through which the region's timber and freight already moved. There was the St. Joseph Telephone and Telegraph Company, which meant the wires and the switchboards, the nervous system by which the district spoke to itself. There was the Port St. Joe Dock and Terminal Company, the deep water outlet to the Gulf, the mouth through which anything grown or cut or milled could reach the sea. There was a sawmill to turn the standing timber into product. And there was the town of Port St. Joe itself, its streets and its houses and the people inside them, changing hands as quietly as the acreage. Consider what a single afternoon of signatures had assembled. One transaction, 1 year, 1933, roughly 240,000 acres. A railroad with its engines and its rails. A telephone company with its wires and its switchboards, a deep-water port and its terminal, a sawmill, and a town. All of it bought at distress prices measured in mere dollars an acre, from sellers who had no better offer and no time to wait for one. It was not the way great estates were normally built, parcel by parcel across a lifetime. It was an empire acquired the way another man might buy a house, in one closing on one day, because the market had collapsed and the money was ready. The genius, if that is the word for it, was not in the vision. It was in the timing and in the nerve to spend when everyone else was too frightened to move. For the people of Port St. Joe, none of this arrived as history. It arrived as an ordinary morning. The town was a company town in the fullest sense of the phrase, a place where the same distant interest that owned the land owned the mill that would rise beside it, the railroad that carried the men to work, the wire that carried their voices home, and in time the very envelope their wages came in. There was a single road that led in and out. There was the rhythm of a shift, the payday that fell on its appointed Friday, the whistle that would come to order the hours of every household within earshot. It was a whole world, and it had its warmth, the warmth of a place where everyone's labor was the same labor and everyone's clock was the same clock. What its people did not know, could not have known, was that the deed to that world had just been signed in another room by a hand they would never shake. The man who now held it had never set out to be their neighbor. He had set out to own the ground they stood on, and he had. But land, however vast, is a slow and stubborn kind of wealth. It sits. It cannot be carried to where it is needed or turned quickly into leverage when a fight arrives. 250,000 acres and a company town made Ball a landlord on a scale few Americans could match, and yet a landlord is not the same thing as a power, and the clerk understood the difference better than most. To hold a region is one thing. To rule it, he would need something the land alone could never give him. He would need money that moved, credit that answered the instant he called for it, a system that could reach into every corner of the state and take hold. And in a Florida still reeling from the same collapse that had just handed him the Panhandle, that system was lying wounded and undefended, waiting for a man with cash to walk in and pick it up. Chapter 4. The banks. He would not lose. There is a difference between the man who owns the ground and the man who owns the money, and in the Florida of the early 1930s, the money was the more desperate thing to own. The same depression that had cleared the land market of rivals had done something far more violent to the banks. Across the state, depositors who had trusted their savings to a name painted on a window arrived one morning to find the doors chained and the glass dark. A bank run is a simple and terrible arithmetic. The moment enough people believe a bank will fail, it does, because no bank on earth keeps every dollar it owes waiting in a drawer. Florida's banks were collapsing in a chain, each failure feeding the fear that toppled the next, and the ordinary people who had built the state's small prosperity were watching it vanish behind locked doors. Into that panic walked one of the very few men in Florida who still had cash he could reach and spend. Alfred was not a banker by trade, but he possessed the one thing a failing bank most needs and can least conjure, which is liquid capital, real money, available now. And so, as the runs spread, he committed something on the order of $15 million to shoring up the Florida banking system, standing behind institutions that would otherwise have gone under and taken their depositors down with them. In the language of the time, it was a rescue, and in the ledgers of the duPont interests, it was something more useful than gratitude. A bank saved by one man's money is a bank that answers to him. Where others had lost everything, the fortune that Ball administered had bought its way to the center of the state's finances at the exact moment those finances were worth least and mattered most. What grew out of that rescue was not a single bank, but a system. At its heart stood the Florida National Bank of Jacksonville, and around it, over the years that followed, assembled the Florida National Group, a chain whose branches would in time number something near 185 spread across the peninsula. In the whole of Florida, only one banking house, Barnett, stood larger. Everywhere a town had grown enough to need a place to keep its money, a Florida National branch was there to keep it, which meant that the same interest that owned the Panhandle's land now held a hand on the state's deposits from the top of the map to the peninsula's tip. Consider what that gave the clerk that the land never could. Land sits and waits. A bank moves. A bank is deposits, other people's money gathered by the millions and lent at the owner's discretion. It is credit, the power to say yes or no to the farmer, the merchant, the developer, the county that needs a loan to build. It is information, because the man who holds the accounts of a region knows who is solvent and who is failing before either of them says a word aloud. And it is reach, a presence in nearly every town that no amount of acreage could buy, the difference between owning a great deal of one place and touching the daily life of the entire state. To be the second banker of Florida was to sit close to every transaction that mattered, and to be owed a favor in every direction at once. The land had made Ball a landlord, but the banks were turning him into a genuine power in the state. Notice, too, what had quietly been assembled under a single roof. In the same hand now sat the banks that held the money and the industry that used it, the lender and the borrower gathered together, the credit and the enterprises it financed answering to the same men. In 1933, that looked like nothing but strength, a machine whose every part fed every other. The deposits of the state flowing toward the businesses the state's second banker happened to own. No one in Jacksonville had any reason to see a flaw in it. It was efficient. It was integrated. It was, in the plainest sense, the whole design. That one fortune should hold both the banks and the businesses at once seemed to Ball not a danger but the very point of the thing. And for the better part of the next 40 years, no one with the power to object would say otherwise. And yet, for all of it, none of this belonged to Ball. Not the land, not the railroad, not the town, and not the banks he had helped to save and grown into a chain across the state. It belonged to Alfred, and Ball administered it the way he did everything, as the trusted hand of a fortune that carried another man's name. He had built the machine, but he did not own a dollar of it. Then, in 1935, Alfred died. Chapter 5. The Will That Made Him King. A man's death is supposed to settle things. A will is read, the property is divided, the name on the deeds is changed, and the world adjusts to the fact that someone is gone. When Alfred I duPont died on the 28th of April, 1935, none of that happened. The fortune he left did not scatter to heirs or dissolve into a dozen smaller hands. On the very day of his death, by the terms he had set down while living, it hardened into a single permanent instrument, the Alfred duPont Testamentary Trust, and passed intact to the men he had chosen to keep it. Nothing was broken apart. The machine that Ball had built did not lose one moving part. It lost only the name that had stood above it, and gained, in that same stroke, a structure designed never to come apart at all. Understand first what the estate itself was, because the number is smaller than the legend, and the difference matters. Alfred's personal estate was appraised at more than $56 million in gross value. Against it stood the tax collectors, and when they had taken their share, something on the order of $30 million in estate and inheritance taxes, what remained to settle was roughly $26 million. That was the estate, the private wealth of one man, taxed and reduced like any other dead man's. It is not the same thing as the trust, and the two figures should never be spoken as one. The trust was the larger vessel, the holding structure that carried the land and the banks and the railroad and the town all together, and its initial corpus was valued at about $40 million. One figure was the private wealth a dead man left behind. The other, larger and entirely separate, was what the machine itself was worth on the morning it became permanent. The design of that structure is the spine of everything that follows, and it is worth laying out exactly. At the very top of it, as the sole charitable beneficiary, Alfred placed the Nemours Foundation, an endowment whose stated purpose was the care of sick and crippled children, and which would in time build and fund a chain of pediatric hospitals carrying the duPont name. Every dollar the machine finally threw off was pledged in the last account to children's medicine. Beneath that purpose sat the trustees who would run the thing, and here the will named Jessie Ball duPont, Alfred's widow and Ball's own sister, as the principal trustee, the figure of record at the head of the fortune. But the name at the head of a trust and the hand that runs it are not always the same, and in this case they were emphatically not. Jessie Ball duPont held the title. Ball held the assets. It was Ball who managed the land, Ball who directed the banks, Ball who bought and sold and built and refused to sell, Ball who sat across the table from every governor and senator and rival who came to deal with the fortune. For the next 46 years, until his own death, he ran the trust essentially alone, a co-trustee in the letter of the document, and the sole operating power in every fact that counted. The clerk who had followed his brother-in-law south now controlled one of the largest private fortunes in the American South, and he controlled it without ever having owned a dollar of it. And so the whole of it came to rest in an arrangement whose shape, stated plainly, is stranger than any comment could make it. At the very summit of the structure sat a charity for sick children. Below that charity, feeding it, ran a political and industrial machine that held 1 million acres of one region, the second-largest bank chain in the state, a railroad, a telephone company, and a company town, all of it directed by one unelected man toward ends that would help decide who governed Florida. The hospital and the machine were not two separate things that happened to share a founder. They were joined by law. In one document, the sick child at the top and the land at the bottom, and the wealth that would heal the one was to be pumped up out of the other. Ball did not build the arrangement to be ironic. He built it to be permanent, and permanence was exactly what it achieved. What that arrangement gave Ball was something no salaried man and few owners ever hold: time without limit, and capital that could not be called away. The trust did not age, did not retire, did not have to divide itself among children of its own. It could wait out a falling market, outlast a strike, buy in a slow decade what a mortal fortune has to seize in a year. Alfred had spent his life assembling the pieces, the land and the banks and the town and the rail, and he had left them, on the day he died, to a man who meant not merely to hold them, but to build something new on top of them. The ground was bought, the money moved, the trust was permanent, and it answered to no one alive. What Ball reached for next was the one thing the Panhandle had in greater supply than any bank vault held in cash, the forests themselves, and his intention was to turn the standing trees into an industry. Chapter 6. The Mill That Drank a River. A forest is not wealth It is only the promise of wealth, standing still, waiting for someone with the patience and the capital to turn it into something that can be sold. Ball had both. He had 1,000,000 acres of pine, and he had a trust that could not be hurried and could not be called away. And what he did with the two together was to build, in a town the trust already owned, a machine that would eat the forest and pay the region for the privilege. The instrument was called the St. Joe Paper Company. It was incorporated in 1936, and it began operations in 1938 on the flat coastal ground of Port St. Joe, the same town that had come to the trust as part of a single Depression purchase. Ball did not build it alone at first. The mill was set up as a joint venture with the Mead Corporation, an established Ohio papermaker that brought the expertise a land trust did not have, the knowledge of how to turn slash pine into craft paperboard at industrial scale. For a few years, the two interests held it together. Then, in 1940, Ball bought out Mead's share, took the presidency of the company for himself, and folded the mill fully into the machine. From that year forward, the paper company answered to the same hand as the land, the banks, and the railroad. What he had assembled, when it was finished, was a closed circle, and every part of it belonged to the trust. The trees grew on the trust's land. They were cut and hauled to the mill on the trust's own railroad, the Apalachicola Northern, the short line that ran down through the pine country to the coast. At the mill, they were pulped and pressed and dried into paperboard, and the finished product went out again by rail and by the port the trust also owned. The forest went in one end as standing timber and came out the other as boxes and cartons for sale, and at no point in that journey did it leave the empire. Ball had not merely bought land. He had built the works that turned the land into money, and the town of Port St. Joe was the place where the turning happened. And the mill was hungry. To cook wood into pulp takes water, enormous quantities of it, and by the 1950s the plant at Port St. Joe was drawing something on the order of 35 million gallons of it a day. 35 million gallons is not a figure the mind holds easily. It is a river's worth of water, taken up and run through the works and sent out again every day so that the paper could be made. The town sat beside that appetite and lived by it. The mill did not visit Port St. Joe. It was Port St. Joe, the reason the houses stood where they stood, and the reason the paychecks came. For the men and women who lived there, the mill was the shape of the day itself. The whistle ordered the hours, calling the shift in before dawn and letting it out at dusk, and a child growing up in Port St. Joe learned the sound of it the way another child learns church bells. The fathers worked the line, the machines, the pulp and the presses and the great rollers, and the mothers kept the households that the wage supported, and the wage came from one place and everyone knew it. There is a warmth in that memory for the people who carried it, the certainty of it, the sense of a town that had a purpose and a sound and a rhythm all its own. The whistle that a man remembers with something like tenderness in his old age is the same whistle that once told him, in the cold dark, that it was time to go and stand at the machine. For Ball, none of that was memory or belonging. It was throughput. The town was the labor supply, the mill was the converter, the forest was the feedstock, and the water was simply an input, taken by the tens of millions of gallons because the process required it. He did not live in Port St. Joe. He ran it from a distance as one more part of a machine whose pieces he counted in acres and deposits and carloads. And the men on the line were a line in the ledger of a company he had taken for himself in a single transaction in 1940. The mill town gave a working world its center and its meaning. To the man at the top of the trust it gave paperboard, and the paperboard gave money, and the money went up, as everything in the machine went up, toward the charity at the summit and the man who ran it all. By the end of the 1930s, the last major peace was in place. The land was bought, the banks were held, the trust was permanent, and now the forest had been turned into an industry that would run in that same town from 1938 until 1996. Ball had all of it at once. What remained was to see, laid out together, exactly how much one unelected man had come to hold. Chapter 7. 1,000,000 acres under one hand. There is a moment in the building of any empire when the pieces stop being separate acquisitions and become, all at once, a single thing too large for the mind to hold whole. For Ed Ball that moment had arrived. Laid out together on one map, the holdings of the trust made a shape that no living Floridian had ever commanded. At its height, the trust owned somewhere between 1,000,000 and 1,200,000 acres of the state, nearly all of it gathered into the northwest, the long panhandle of pine and coastal plain that runs from the Georgia line down to the Gulf. It was, by that measure, the second largest private landholding in all of Florida. Only one owner in the whole state held more. 1,000,000 acres is a phrase that slides past the ear without leaving a mark, so it is worth stopping to make it real. 1,000,000 acres is more than 1,500 square miles. Set against the small states of the country, the trust's land approached, in a single stretch of one American region, the entire land area of Delaware, the very state the duPonts had come from, the state whose name the fortune still carried. What Alfred duPont had fled, his brother-in-law had nearly rebuilt in acreage on the far side of the map, not as a home, but as a holding. A man could drive for the better part of a day through the northwest of Florida and rarely be certain he had left ground the trust controlled. And it was not raw land alone. Most of it had been taken in during the worst years of the Depression, when distress had driven the price of Florida timberland down to a few dollars an acre, and Ball, with a trust behind him that could not be hurried and would never be called away, had bought while other men were forced to sell. That was how the domain had been assembled, and the arithmetic of it was not gentle. The same collapse that ruined the sellers had armed the buyer. Every failed farm and foreclosed timber tract that came to the trust for dollars an acre was another man's ruin folded into one man's estate, and by the end there were 1,000,000 acres of such tracts stitched together into the largest private domain the state had ever seen. What made it an empire rather than a fortune was that the land did not sit alone. Under that same single trust, answering to that same single hand, ran everything a domain of that size could need. There was the land itself, the pine and the coast. There was the Apalachicola Northern Railroad, the short line that carried the timber down through the interior to the water. There was the St. Joseph Telephone and Telegraph Company, so that the region's own voice traveled on the trust's wires. There were the banks, the Florida National Group, second in the state to none but Barnett, holding the deposits and the credit of the very country the trust owned. And there was the paper mill at Port St. Joe, the converter at the center of it, turning the trees into money. Land, rail, telephone, bank, and mill, 5 instruments that across most of America belonged to 5 different companies and 5 different sets of owners, here belonged to one trust and were run by one man who had begun as a clerk. Nothing in Florida was arranged like it, and nothing had been before. A single unelected private citizen sat atop a closed system that grew the timber, cut it, hauled it on his own rails, financed it through his own banks, spoke over his own wires, and sold the finished paper out through his own port, and every dollar of it climbed, at the end, toward the children's charity at the summit and the man who governed the whole in its name. Seen from a distance, in that one year at the top of the climb, it had the look of a small country with a single citizen at the head of it. This was the height of it. Everything to this point had been ascent, the clerk becoming the steward becoming the master of 1,000,000 acres, and there is an undeniable awe in the sheer completeness of what one man had gathered under one hand. But a machine this large does not simply idle at its peak. The man who runs it, having taken all that a single American region had to give, begins to want the things that acreage and paperboard cannot buy. And in 1961, Ed Ball found one of them. He reached beyond the Panhandle, beyond his own country of pine, and bought a bankrupt railroad that carried a name every Floridian already knew. Chapter 8. The Railroad Flagler Left Behind. The name on the bankrupt railroad was one every Floridian already knew, because it belonged to the man who had drawn the eastern coast of the state into being. In 1961, Ball moved to take control of the Florida East Coast Railway, the line that Henry Morrison Flagler had pushed down the Atlantic shore 2 generations before, the road that had lain in receivership since the collapse of the Florida boom. Through the trust, he bought up a majority of its stock, and he brought the railway, at last, out of the long bankruptcy that had held it since the early 1930s. This channel has told Flagler's own story elsewhere, the grand hotels and the ocean rails and the ruin waiting at the end of them. What matters in the Panhandle account is only the strange arithmetic of inheritance. The railroad that one dead Titan had built to open Florida now answered to another man he had never met, a clerk out of the Northwest Pine who had turned a widow's fortune into a domain and reached clear across the peninsula to close his hand on the coast that still carried the older man's name. It was the first time the machine reached beyond its own country of timber and port, and it was the first time the machine met an enemy it could not simply buy. The trouble began almost as soon as the road was his. In 1963, the non-operating unions of the Florida East Coast walked out over wages and work rules, expecting the short, sharp settlement that such strikes usually brought a railroad. They had misjudged the man on the other side of the table. Ball would not bargain. He kept the trains moving with supervisors and replacement crews, turned away the mediators one after another, and settled in for a siege, treating the walkout not as a labor dispute to be resolved, but as an enemy to be outlasted. The old toast he had raised for years over the trust's business might have been written for the occasion. Confusion to the enemy. The unions believed they had struck a corporation. They discovered instead that they were at war with a temperament, and a temperament backed by a fortune that could not be starved into terms. What followed was not a season of picketing, but a war of attrition that ran on and on past every reasonable expectation of its end. Trains were derailed and track was dynamited along the line that ran from the yards at Jacksonville down the coast toward Miami. Federal marshals rode the rails to guard the crews. Bombs were set against the company's property in the dark, and still neither side gave way, because the one side that could have ended it by yielding had resolved never to yield at all. By 1968, the railroad had stopped carrying passengers altogether, ending a service that had run down the length of the coast since Flagler's own day, and even that did not break the strike. The passenger cars went quiet, the freight kept moving under guard, and the men who had walked out 5 years before were still on the picket line outside the yards. The full length of that strike, and the hidden machine that allowed one private man to wage it, is still ahead in this account. For the histories of the great American land empires and of the men and women who lived their whole lives inside them, subscribe to Empire of Acres and stay with the story to its end. And if your own people worked the Florida East Coast line through those years, or stood a picket outside its yards in the heat, set it down in the comments below, where the longest of these strikes is still remembered by the families who carried it. It ground on through the rest of the decade and into the next, through changes of Union leadership and rounds of federal intervention, until it had become one of the longest railroad strikes in the history of the country. Only in 1977, 14 years after the first walkout, did it finally end, and it ended on terms far nearer the companies than the workers. Ball had done the thing that almost no employer in America could have done. He had outweighted an entire arm of the national labor movement, and he had won. The victory laid bare something the Panhandle had understood for decades, but that the rest of the state was only beginning to see. A man who answered to no shareholders that could pressure him, no voters that could turn him out, and no office that could be taken away, could simply outlast anyone set against him. The strike had run for 14 years for one plain reason. The single man on the far side of it had nothing whatever to fear from its length. A corporation that must show its owners a profit each quarter settles. A politician who must stand before an electorate bends. Ball did neither, because the fortune behind him could not be hurried, and the power beside him could not be voted out. That was the deeper truth the Railroad War had exposed, and it was a truth larger than any railroad. Ball's strength did not finally rest on the Florida East Coast line, or on the banks, or even on the million acres of the Northwest. It rested on something that carried no name on any map and held no seat in any chamber. A government he had raised up inside the elected government of Florida, one that no citizen of the state had ever chosen and that few had ever glimpsed at work. How a clerk who had never once stood for office came to command that kind of power, answerable to no ballot ever cast, is the machine the next chapter takes apart. He had built it in plain sight, and almost no one had seen. Chapter 9. The government no one elected. The answer was not a secret so much as a habit, one grown so old and so quiet that the men who lived under it had ceased to see it as power at all. Ed Ball never held an elected office in the state of Florida. He never ran for one, never filed for one, never once submitted his name to the judgment of a single voter. And for the better part of 4 decades, he governed the state more surely than any man who did. The government that answered to him carried no seal and kept no chamber of its own. It sat inside the lawful government the citizens of Florida had chosen, wearing that government's offices like borrowed clothes, and it did the work he required of it. It worked because Ball had understood, earlier and more coldly than his rivals, that in Florida the men who made the laws were not chosen by the people of Florida in any honest proportion. They were chosen by the map. And the map had been frozen in place a generation before, drawn to a Florida of empty pine counties and cotton crossroads, and never redrawn as the peninsula filled. Miami had risen out of the mangrove into a city of hundreds of thousands. Tampa and Jacksonville had swelled with newcomers by the trainload. The southern coasts had become the fastest-growing country in the nation. But the legislature that ruled all of it still answered to the districts of the old rural North, where a few thousand voters in a county of pine woods elected the same single senator that 250,000 city dwellers elected to the south. A rural county with a few thousand souls sent a man to the capital with as much weight as Dade sent for its hundreds of thousands. The consequence was arithmetic, and it was ruthless. By the middle of the century, a small fraction of the state's population, well under a fifth of it, could elect a clear majority of the men who wrote its laws, and that fraction lived in precisely the counties Ball knew best. Out of that broken proportion rose the instrument the whole machine was built upon, a block of rural legislators, conservative to the marrow, drawn from the emptiest counties of North and Central Florida, learned that by voting together they could command the legislature entire. They numbered around 20. A Tampa newspaperman, contemptuous of the way they served the country interests over the crowded coasts, gave them the name that stuck to them for the rest of their lives. He called them the Pork Chop Gang, and the name was meant as an insult, and they wore it for 30 years as very nearly a badge. From the 1930s into the middle 1960s, this handful of men from the depopulated counties held the state of Florida in their hands, killing what they wished to kill, passing what they wished to pass, and answering, in the end, to the interests that could reach them. No interest reached them so reliably as the one seated in the Northwest Pine. Ball did not command the pork choppers from any office, because he held none. He commanded them the way he commanded everything, through the levers a fortune puts in a patient man's hand. He held the banks their counties depended on, the Florida national chain that carried the deposits and made the loans across the whole of North Florida, so that a legislator from a small county was very often a man whose town, whose farms, whose own affairs turned on the goodwill of an institution Ball controlled. He held newspapers, and a newspaper in a small county is the thing that decides what a man's neighbors believe about him. And he held what left no record at all, the cash that moved from the trust's rooms to the men who served its purposes, unreported, unregistered, appearing in no ledger any auditor would ever read. A bank loan, a friendly headline, an envelope that no one wrote down. These were the currency of the government no one had elected, and Ball minted all three. The creed that governed it he had carried for years, and it fit this work as well as it fit the strike. Power that keeps no chamber and files no name is power that cannot easily be found, and what cannot be found cannot be fought. He met with legislators privately and left no minutes. He funded campaigns through channels that surfaced under no one's name. He asked for nothing in public and received nearly everything in private, and the men who did his work in the daylight went home to counties where his money had already been quietly at work in the dark. For the ordinary Floridian, whose vote had been drained of its weight by a map 3 decades stale, the whole apparatus was invisible. Few had ever glimpsed it. Almost none could have named the man at the center of it, drinking his orange juice alone in the Northwest Pine, while the state he did not govern on paper did as he wished. What finally loosened his grip was not an election, because elections had been the thing rigged against reform from the start. It was the courts, and then the law itself. Through the 1960s, the federal judiciary held, state after state, that a legislature must represent people and not acres, that a citizen's vote in a crowded county must weigh the same as a citizen's vote in an empty one. The principle had a plain name, one person, one vote, and it fell on Florida's frozen map like a blade. Under its pressure, the malapportioned districts on which the pork chop gang had stood for a generation were struck down and drawn again, and the whole machinery was written into the new Florida Constitution of 1968, which at last apportioned the legislature to the people who actually lived in the state. The block from the emptiest counties dissolved almost overnight, its power gone the moment its districts were made to answer for their emptiness. The government no one had elected began, for the first time in 40 years, to be governed by the ones who had. But Ball had never used the machine only to guard what he held. Long before the map broke, he had turned it outward and aimed it at a single man he had resolved to drive from public life. He did not merely wield the hidden government, he used it to destroy an enemy by name. Chapter 10. The Senator he set out to break. The man he chose was named Claude Pepper, and for a long time he seemed beyond Ball's reach. Pepper had come up out of Alabama clay and a Florida law office to win a seat in the United States Senate in 1936, and he had used it in a way that Ed Ball watched with a cold and deepening loathing. He was a new dealer to the bone, A friend of organized labor, an advocate of federal old age pensions and national health insurance and a wage floor set in Washington. Everything Ball had built rested on the opposite conviction that the fewer the rules a fortune answered to the better, and here was a man of national stature carrying the other creed to the floor of the Senate under the flag of Ball's own state. To Ball, the senator was not merely a political rival. He was a standing insult to the order the trust existed to preserve, and Ball resolved to remove him from public life. The first attempt failed, and it failed plainly. In 1944, Ball threw the weight of his money and his newspapers behind an effort to deny Pepper renomination in the Democratic primary, which in the one-party Florida of that era was the only election that decided anything. The effort came apart. Pepper was at the height of his popularity, a wartime senator close to a president the voters still revered, and he beat back the challenge and returned to Washington with his seat intact. A lesser man might have read the result as a verdict and let it stand. Ball read it as a rehearsal. He had learned where the senator was strong, and he set himself to wait for the season when that strength would turn. The season came at the end of the decade. Roosevelt was dead, the war was won, and the country had begun to turn against the very things Pepper stood for, curdling its wartime alliance with the Soviet Union into a fear of everything that carried the scent of the left. Pepper had been an open friend of that alliance while it lasted, and now the friendship hung around his neck. Into that opening, Ball moved a candidate, a young congressman named George Armistead Smathers, who had once been Pepper's own protege and now turned on him with the particular ferocity of a favored son. The 1950 Democratic primary that followed became one of the most savage in the history of American politics. Smathers's men painted the senator as soft on communism and hung a nickname on him, Red Pepper, that did the work of 1,000 speeches. The money to carry that message across every county in Florida had to come from somewhere, and much of it came from the Northwest Pine. Ball was its principal source. He held no office in the campaign and wanted none, took no title, appeared on no letterhead, and directed a great share of the effort from behind the same curtain he directed everything else. He opened his own accounts, and he opened the accounts of the men who depended on him, and by the reckoning of those who studied the race afterward, he raised sums for Smathers on single afternoons that ordinary campaigns of the day would have counted a fortune. What the exact figures were, the surviving records do not let anyone say with confidence, and the largest of them come down second-hand. But the shape of it is not in doubt. A private citizen who had never once stood before the voters of Florida became the financial engine that unseated one of the most powerful senators the state had ever sent to Washington. When the votes were counted, Pepper had lost, driven from the seat he had held for 14 years, and Ball had done what no ballot bearing his own name could ever have done. Here the story arrives at the question it cannot answer for the viewer, and will not try to. Was this the ordinary machinery of a republic, a citizen spending his own money to support the candidate he preferred, the same right the poorest voter holds in smaller coin and no more sinister for being larger? Or was it the moment a single fortune reached past the ballot altogether and simply purchased the outcome the ballot was meant to decide, buying a United States Senate seat the way it had bought a county in 1933? The facts do not settle it. A man with no office and no constituency chose and paid for who would represent more than 2 million Floridians in Washington, and the law of the day let him. What that was, and what it should be called, is left where it belongs, with the people who lived under the result and the ones who study it still. Whatever it was, it confirmed the thing that had made Ball untouchable for a generation. He did not need to win an election to end a career, did not need a title to break a titled man, did not need the voters' leave to decide who spoke for them. Inside the borders of Florida, there was by 1950 no office and no rival with the reach to touch him. The banks were his, the land was his, the legislature answered to his money, and now the state's own senators sat or fell at his discretion. Nothing the state could do would move him. The thing that finally did came from Washington. It was not a scandal, and it was not aimed at his politics at all. It was a law. Chapter 11. The Law That Split the Machine. It carried no subpoena and no headline, and it accused him of nothing, because there was nothing to accuse. The blow that finally landed on Edward Ball came from the floor of the United States Congress, and it was entirely indifferent to what he had done or how cleverly he had done it. For 4 decades he had built his defenses against the only kinds of attack he understood. The rival candidate could be outspent. The hostile newspaper could be bought or answered by one of his own. The senator with a national following could be waited out until the country turned against him. Against all of them, Ball had proven immovable. Against a change in the plain text of federal law, he had no defense at all, because a statute cannot be outspent, cannot be outweighted, and cannot be made afraid. The man whose favorite toast was confusion to the enemy had met, at the last, an enemy that could not be confused. The instrument was the Bank Holding Company Act. Congress had first written it in the 1950s to keep banking and commerce apart, on the old Republican suspicion that a company which controlled both the money and the industry that money fed had grown too powerful to leave alone. In the late 1960s, the lawmakers returned to it and closed its loopholes, and the amended act now said, in language that admitted no exception for a charity, that an entity controlling a bank could not also control enterprises that had nothing to do with banking. It was a rule written for the whole country, aimed at no one in particular. But there was, in all of America, scarcely a better description of the thing Ed Ball had assembled in Florida, for that was precisely the shape of the machine. The Alfred I duPont Testamentary Trust held the Florida National Group, a chain grown to something near 185 branches, second in the state only to Barnett. And the same trust, in the same hand, held St. Joe Paper and its mill, the Apalachicola Northern Railroad, the telephone company, and 1,000,000 acres of the Panhandle. Banks and industry, the money and the land it moved, gathered under one roof and worked by one man. It was the completeness of the design that had made it invincible inside Florida. It was the completeness of the design that the law now reached for. Here, the machinery of Ball's power turned, in the end, into the instrument of its own division. The trust had been the master stroke of the whole enterprise, the single vessel that let one clerk hold banks and land and rail and paper together and answer to no shareholder and no voter for any of it. But because it was one vessel and not many, because Alfred's will had bound all of it into a single indivisible estate, the law had only to touch that one structure to unmake the rest. A scattered fortune could have hidden its pieces in 100 separate names. Ball's fortune had no pieces. It was one thing, and Congress had ruled that one thing could not stand. The very unity that was the source of his strength was the seam along which he was cut. And so the man who had spent his life refusing to sell was ordered to choose. He could keep the banks, or he could keep the industry, but the law would no longer let the trust hold both. It was, for Ball, the cruelest arithmetic of his career, because each half had built the other, and both were his. He chose the land. He let the banks go and kept St. Joe, the mill, the acres, the railroad, the physical empire on the ground, that had been his first love since the county he had bought whole in 1933. In 1971, the trust sold the controlling share of the bank network it had spent 40 years assembling. By 1973, the banks were gone from his hands entirely, divested down to the last branch, the Florida national name passing on to serve owners Alfred duPont had never met. The irony of it would not have been lost on him, and there is no sign that it was. Claude Pepper had thrown everything he had at Ball and lost his Senate seat for the trouble. The striking men of the Florida East Coast Railway had held out for 14 years and moved him not an inch. The reformers and the courts had labored a generation to break the rural machine that guarded him. None of them had taken a single bank from him. What no rival and no ballot and no strike had managed to do, a paragraph of federal statute did in the space of 2 years, without malice, without a trial, and without ever once speaking his name. The empire had been split not by scandal, but by law, and the law had needed no enemy to do it. Yet the banks were only the first cut, and the shallowest. Losing them cost Ball a limb of the machine, but the machine still stood, still vast, still his. The wound that would bleed the empire slowly for the rest of the century was not written in Washington at all. It had been waiting inside Alfred's own will from the first day, a single clause counted out in percentages, set to be handed one day to the very people the trust had been built to serve. It had been there all along. Chapter 12. The Empire Unmade by Its Own Will. The clause was a few lines of a lawyer's arithmetic, and it would take a quarter of a century to do its work. Alfred duPont had written the trust to serve the Nemours Foundation, the children's charity that sat, unseen, at the very top of the whole machine, and for 40 years that obligation had cost Ball almost nothing, because a trust may satisfy a charity with a trickle while the corpus grows behind it. But in 1980, a federal consent decree fixed the trickle at a number. The trust would thereafter pay the Nemours Foundation not less than 3% of its net market value every year in cash without end. It was not a fine, and it was not a judgment. It was simply the will, at the last, being made to mean what it had always said. Where Congress had struck once and been done, the will would strike a little every year, quietly, for the rest of the century. 3% sounds like mercy until one understands what the trust was made of. Its wealth was not money in an account. It was St. Joe, the paper company and the land beneath it, held as stock that could not be spent and would not, on its own, produce cash on the scale the decree now demanded. To hand the charity 3% of everything, year upon year, the trust had only one thing it could sell, and that thing was the empire itself. So it sold. Slowly, by the terms of a document no one had read closely in 50 years, the trust began to feed St. Joe into the market a piece at a time, converting land and mill and company back into the dollars the will required. It had once held something near 70% of the firm. By 2004, that holding had fallen toward 8%. No rival had done this, and no banking law. The charity had become a creditor that could never be fully paid, and year by year the estate was being taken apart to satisfy it, one required payment after another. There was nothing here to outspend and no enemy to outweight. The mill went first, as the living things always do. The Port St. Joe paper mill had run since 1938, and for 60 years its whistle had been the clock of the town, the sound that woke the shifts and sent the men down the road to the line and called them back again at dusk. Children had been raised to that rhythm. A boy could grow up in the shadow of it, higher on where his father had worked, and hear the same horn over the same water his whole life. In 1998, it stopped. The mill closed, and within 5 years the buildings that had drunk a river and paid a town were pulled down and carried off, gone by 2003, until the ground where they had stood held nothing but the outline of them. The company that had once owned the town no longer had any use for it. What the whistle had ordered for 3 generations, it now ordered no longer, because there was nothing left to order and no one left to answer. What St. Joe became instead had nothing to do with paper. The land had always been the only asset that truly mattered, and a new generation of managers looked at the Panhandle ball, had gathered for dollars an acre, and saw not timber but lots. In 1997, the company hired Peter Rummel, a man who had built resorts for the Disney Company, and bought Arvida, a Florida development firm, and set about turning the empire on the ground into master-planned communities sold by the frontage. The pine that had fed the mill was cleared for fairways and cul-de-sacs, and the coast that had grown trees for a paperboard machine now grew subdivisions for people who would never hear a mill whistle. In 2014, the reinvention reached its purest form. St. Joe sold roughly 380,000 acres, a tract larger than some American counties, to Ag Reserves, a farming concern owned by the Mormon Church, for $562 million. The land that had made a clerk a king was priced and moved like any other inventory, and the men who signed the papers had never met him. And yet the thing at the top of it all did not shrink. It grew. Every acre sold, every share divested, every payment counted out under the consent decree flowed upward to the same place it had been promised from the beginning, the charity Alfred had named before any of the rest existed. The Alfred duPont Testamentary Trust is still there today. As of 2023, it held roughly $8.2 billion, and it still exists for the single purpose set out in a dead man's will, to fund the care of sick children through the Nemours Foundation, spending, by the old stipulation, only where the document allows. The machine that Ed Ball built to hold a state has spent decades coming apart, its banks divested, its mill demolished, its acres handed to strangers a county at a time. The charity it was built to feed has never in its life been richer. The empire had been designed from its first day to consume itself in slow motion so that a hospital ledger might grow, and that is exactly, patiently, what it has gone on doing. The machine, then, would outlive its own dismemberment. Reduced, rerouted, unrecognizable, some version of the thing the clerk assembled is running even now, paying out to the children as it was always meant to. But a man is not a trust. He cannot be written to endure by contract, cannot pay out 3% of himself each year and go on standing. The empire had been built to survive its founder, and it had been built, in the end, to survive even its own unmaking. The one who ran it had not. By the summer of 1981, the same patient arithmetic that would keep the machine alive was closing, at last, on the man. Chapter 13. The Fortune. He left the children. He died on the 24th of June, 1981, an old man who had lived more than 90 years and outlasted nearly everyone who had ever tried to stop him. There was no collapse and no scandal at the end, only the ordinary arithmetic of a long life reaching its last figure. The clerk who had come south a stranger, who had never held an office or stood for a vote or explained himself to anyone, went out of the world as quietly as he had moved through it, and the machine he had run for 46 years did not so much as pause. It had been built to outlast him. On the morning he died, it simply went on without him, counting out its payments to the children as it had been told to, exactly as though nothing had happened, because in the only terms that governed it, nothing had. What he left behind divided cleanly into 2 figures, and the larger of them was not his. The trust had come to him in the 1930s worth something near $40 million. A fortune already, the inheritance written into a dead man's will. When he died, it was worth about $2 billion. One set of hands had taken it up at $40 million and set it down at $2,000 million, grown roughly 50 times over across a single working life, without a partner to answer to, or an heir to satisfy, or a ballot to win. No fortune in the state's history had been enlarged so far by one man, and almost no one in the state could have named the man who did it. His own estate was a smaller thing, and even its size was never fully settled. The tallies ran from $75 million to $200 million, depending on who counted and what they chose to count. The private wealth a man gathers in the margins of running something far larger than himself. Nearly all of it went where the trust above him already pointed, to the Nemours Foundation, the children's charity Alfred duPont had named before Ed Ball ever touched a single share of it. And to the gift he fixed one condition, the condition of a man who had spent his whole life on one idea. The money could be spent, but it could be spent in Florida and nowhere else. Even in death he would not let the fortune leave the state he had held. Set the two things he left side by side, and the whole of it stands there, without a word of judgment required. On the one side, 46 years in which a private citizen chose who governed a state, seated its legislators and unseated its senators, settled its taxes and its banks and its railroads, all of it from outside any office and beyond the reach of any vote ever cast. 4 decades of a government no one had elected and no one could vote out, because the man who ran it had put his name on nothing. On the other side, a fortune bound by the same unbending will to the care of sick children, spent inside the borders of the state he had ruled for as long as the money should last. The same man built both, out of the same land and the same patience, and left them standing together when he was gone. And there are people still living whose lives were written inside that fact. If your grandfather woke before dawn to the Port St. Joe mill whistle, or drew his pay on the Apalachicola Northern Line, or kept what little he had in a Florida National branch that Ed Ball owned and never once mentioned, then some part of your family's story was set down by a man it never met and could not vote against. Those families know things the records do not. Leave what yours remembers of the mill towns, the railroad, and the bank in the comments below, and subscribe so that memory rides forward with the next of these stories instead of vanishing with the buildings. What became of all of it is, even now, unfinished. The trust endures, richer than it was on the day he died, still feeding a children's hospital and still unwinding itself by inches. The mill is gone, and the land is sold, and the banks belong to strangers, and somewhere in Florida a sick child is being cared for on money a clerk assembled a county at a time. Whether that is a fair exchange for a state governed 40 years from behind a curtain is not a thing the record settles, and it is not a thing this account will pretend to settle. The man is dead. The fortune goes on. And Florida, all these years later, is still living inside the shape of what one clerk, answering to no one, decided it would be.